We all love a good hero story, right? But what happens when we start peeling back the layers of those iconic figures and take a look at the person behind the polished image?
Well, I think that's what history's all about, right? It's so easy to get caught up in the legend, but the real fascination comes when you start looking at the complexities and the contradictions of these individuals.
Exactly, and today we're going deep on a figure who's practically synonymous with American legend, John F. Kennedy, the 35th president.
Oh, yeah. The name JFK instantly conjures up images of Camelot, youthful vigor, and this sort of optimistic idealism that defined the early 60s.
And that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking in this deep dive. We're going to go beyond that carefully constructed image of Camelot and explore some of the lesser known, maybe even darker aspects of Kennedy's life and his presidency.
We've got some fascinating source material here that digs into some of those controversies and hidden truths that really challenge the conventional narrative.
Yeah, so we're talking about everything from secret health battles to reckless personal behavior to potential ties with organized crime, even.
We're going to try and paint a more complete picture of this really complex and often contradictory figure.
All right, so let's start with this whole Camelot thing, right? It's such a powerful image, but where did it actually come from?
Well, it really took hold after Kennedy's assassination. Jacqueline Kennedy famously compared his presidency to the mythical court of King Arthur.
Right, this idea of a sort of golden age marked by chivalry and nobility and a strong moral compass.
Exactly, and it resonated really deeply with the public, especially at a time of national mourning. But as our sources point out, this image of Camelot was in many ways a facade. It concealed a much more complicated reality.
And one of the most striking revelations is the truth about JFK's health. I mean, we
Mhm.
all remember those photos, right?
Yeah.
The young, vibrant president, full of
Yeah,
energy.
the picture of health. But behind the scenes, Kennedy was actually battling some serious health issues. He had Addison's disease, which is a lifelong condition affecting the adrenal glands, and he also suffered from chronic debilitating back pain.
Wow, so not just minor aches and pains. These were serious conditions that required constant medication, even experimental treatments.
Absolutely. And the sources really make you question his fitness for office, given the demands of the presidency. Was he always able to make clear-headed decisions? Was his judgment ever impaired by medication or pain? And perhaps most importantly, what are the implications of keeping this all hidden from the public?
Right, it raises questions about transparency and accountability and whether the American people were fully informed about the man they had entrusted with such enormous power.
And then there's the whole issue of Kennedy's personal conduct, which our sources really don't shy away from.
Okay, so let's talk about this long list of extramarital affairs, as the sources put it. Now, we know that presidents are human, too, and that their personal lives shouldn't necessarily be subject to public scrutiny. But in Kennedy's case, these affairs weren't just private matters.
Right? They went far beyond just infidelity. Some of these relationships involved individuals who posed serious risks to national security.
Yeah, we're talking about alleged affairs with suspected spies and individuals connected to organized crime, which raises some really unsettling possibilities.
Absolutely. It begs the question, to what extent was Kennedy vulnerable to blackmail or manipulation? Could these relationships have compromised sensitive information or even influenced his decision-making as president?
And speaking of organized crime, the sources also delve into the Kennedy family's alleged ties to the mob. This is where things get really murky.
Yeah, there's this long-standing rumor that Joseph P. Kennedy, JFK's father, had connections to organized crime figures, and that he may have even used these connections to help his son get elected.
Specifically, the sources allege that there was some shady dealings going on during the 1960 election, possibly involving vote buying and other illegal activities in key states like Illinois.
And this is where the whole double-crossing theory comes into play. Once in office, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched a pretty aggressive crackdown on organized crime.
So the mob felt betrayed by the Kennedys after allegedly helping them get into power, which some speculate could have played a role in JFK's assassination.
It's definitely a theory that's been explored extensively, and it certainly adds another layer of intrigue to the already complex circumstances surrounding Kennedy's death.
Okay, well, let's shift gears now and talk about Kennedy's foreign policy. One of the early defining events of his presidency was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, as we know, was a complete disaster.
It was a failed CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. and it really tarnished America's image on the world stage.
The sources point out that while Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility for the fiasco behind closed doors, he was blaming everyone else, the CIA, his military advisors.
Which, creates this whole other dynamic within his administration, Ryan. It suggests a lack of trust and a willingness to deflect blame.
And of course, the Bay of Pigs had lasting repercussions. It arguably contributed to the escalation of the Cold War and set the stage for the even more perilous Cuban Missile Crisis just a year later.
Ah, yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis, often hailed as Kennedy's finest hour, the moment when he stared down the Soviets and averted nuclear war.
But our sources suggest that it was more than just a shining example of presidential leadership. They frame it as a risky gamble, one that could have easily backfired with catastrophic consequences.
Right. It was a high-stakes game of chicken with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. And there were all sorts of behind-the-scenes maneuvering concessions that the public wasn't even aware of at the time.
Like the secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Cuba.
Exactly. And some historians argue that Kennedy's own actions, his earlier hardline stance against Cuba and the Soviet Union, may have actually contributed to the crisis in the first place.
So it's a more nuanced picture than the simple narrative of Kennedy, the hero, single-handedly saving the world.
It's a reminder that even the most celebrated moments in history are often the result of complex and sometimes even flawed decision-making.
All right, well, let's turn our attention now to domestic policy. Kennedy's record on civil rights is often cited as one of his major achievements, but the sources offer a more critical perspective.
They suggest that his approach to civil rights was more pragmatic than principled. They argue that he was initially hesitant to fully embrace the movement out of fear of alienating Southern Democrats who were a key part of his political base.
So it was only under immense pressure from civil rights activists, the March on Washington, the escalating violence, that he finally started to take more decisive action.
Right. The sources paint a picture of a president who was initially more concerned with political calculations than with moral imperatives.
Then on that note, let's talk about the really controversial stuff, the CIA covert operations that were ramped up under Kennedy's watch.
Yeah, this is some pretty dark territory. The sources document a significant increase in clandestine activities, including assassination plots against foreign leaders like Fidel Castro.
There's even a detailed account of something called Operation Mongoose, which was this elaborate secret program designed to destabilize Cuba, using all sorts of bizarre and unethical tactics.
We're talking about things like poisoning Castro's cigars and even trying to sabotage his beard.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously. It really raises questions about the ethical boundaries of U.S. foreign policy during this period, and it certainly contributed to the perception of America as an imperialist power meddling in the affairs of other countries.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here. The hidden health battles, the reckless personal behavior, the potential mob ties the foreign policy, gambles the evolving stance on civil rights, the covert operations. And it all seems to culminate in that tragic day in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy remains one of the most shocking and enduring mysteries of the 20th century. And as we've discussed, the many secrets and controversies surrounding Kennedy's life and presidency have only fueled the countless conspiracy theories that have emerged over the years.
Right. The Warren Commission's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone has been challenged by a whole host of alternative explanations implicating everyone from the CIA and the mafia to Fidel Castro himself.
And it's this lack of transparency, the lingering questions about what really happened, that continue to fascinate and haunt us to this day.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and legacy of John F. Kennedy, it's clear that the shiny image of Camelot obscures a much more complicated and often troubling reality.
Absolutely. And this is not about diminishing his accomplishments or demonizing him. It's about recognizing the full spectrum of his humanity, his flaws, his contradictions.
Because ultimately, it's in those imperfections that we find the true measure of a man, right?
I think so. And it's in grappling with these complexities that we can gain a deeper understanding of history, not as a neat and tidy narrative, but as a messy and often ambiguous human drama.
So we leave you with this. How does acknowledging the darker side of an admired leader change your perception of their achievements? Does it make their successes seem more human, more relatable, or does it tarnish their legacy in some way? These are questions worth pondering as we continue to grapple with the complexities of history and the enduring enigma that is John F. Kennedy.
Indeed. It's a conversation that will likely continue for generations to come.
And on that note, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time.